Good afternoon. Welcome to Corrections. I know this is kind of weird. Wasn't formally announced that we were meeting today, which is okay because I'm just going to have you, I'm going to do an hour overview of theory as it pertains to corrections and prisons and the philosophies behind it. So I really don't expect anyone to hop on here live. However, if you do, that is absolutely terrific. Use the chat board to discuss and put your name in. But essentially, all I'm going to do is track through the three major paradigms as it pertains to prisons and corrections. This will be very useful for when we come up to the exam, which is coming up in a few weeks. And I know that some of you are curious as to what we're going to be covering, but don't worry about that. We're definitely going to cover plenty. It'll tie your textbook in with some of your assignments, etc. So, gosh, we have 7 people here. I didn't expect all that. Hey, let's see here. Megan Mitchell. Hey, Megan. Melanie. Isaac. What's happening? I'm glad to see you all. I'm shocked. Did you did you come in through the announcement board, which I do appreciate. Yes, it's definitely a medical question. How did you know, Aradio? You're funny, man. You're funny, man. You know what? As a matter of fact, Aradio, the medical model of criminology was really important in the construction of corrections, as a matter of fact. So let me go ahead, let me just see, first of all, let me apologize for a couple things before I get into the gist of today's class. And I think I've lost track of all your names, so you have to excuse me. I don't know who's in which class anymore. So, you know, when I have, what, 240 students this semester, 220 students, and you know, since it's all virtual, I never know who's in class, who's in which class or whatever. But last week, or was it, yeah, we were supposed to live stream last week for this particular class, and as you may or may not know, what really happened is I knew we were coming back to live classes on campus, and I knew that there was going to be some confusion as to when do we come in, what if there's an overlap between our live stream and there's an overlap with the live class on campus. And if you're on campus and now you can't get to a computer because the library is closed, you have no way of accessing the live stream. I knew you'd be worried about attendance and all that kind of stuff. So I just decided that let me figure this thing out, which I've done, and let me go ahead and I think what I'll do is exactly what I am doing. I'm doing the live stream today. I have a narcotics class that meets at 5:40. So what I think I'll do for the rest of the semester starting this week, and well, I still have to think that one through, is I will do live streams, but I'm going to go ahead and make the videotape, and I'm going to post it inside of the announcement board. I took a look at some of your assignments for cruel and unusual punishment, and those of you who did it really did it well. I don't know about you, but that is one of the, out of all the classes that I take, or that I teach, that's one of my favorite assignments. It is, the difference is, it's typically in a live class, I randomly give everybody a country, so we have different countries represented, but given the fact that we don't meet face to face, I couldn't break us into groups, because what I do is break us into groups, and then in groups of 4 or 5 you pass your papers around so everybody can read them. And what you'll find is that the punishments that are used from around the world are just unbelievable. It depends on where you are, depends on what year it is, and what seems sometimes grotesque really does tell us a lot about politics. It tells us a lot about philosophy. It tells us a lot about theory. Because here's what we know, okay? If we go back through the history of punishment, which is basically what you were to write about. If you take a look at the history of punishment, punishment varies according to cultural standards, right? But it also varies in accordance to structural standards. If we were to take a look at, I'm going to pull out, this is from the video called Who Am I, right? And it is posted in one of your early announcements. But if you go back to this particular diagram, right, that was in that particular video, if we take a look at this, we would see that on top of the picture, we have economic institution, political institution, the family institution, education institution, the religious institution, media, and then criminal justice can be put in there too. Those institutions, and what an institution is, For those of you who are interested, I'll just write you a definition. An institution is a stable cluster of social structures, which are patterns of expected behavior designed to meet basic human needs. Okay? That's what a social institution is. A social institution is a stable cluster of social structures designed to meet basic human needs. Pretty easy. And I know we've talked about it before, but I want to just cover it again. For example, one of our most basic human needs is the need to distribute goods and services, right? And in a capitalist economy, if you need, I don't know, a notebook, or let's say a textbook, you go to the bookstore, you give them your money, and in return for the money, they'll give you the textbook. That's an exchange economy. You go to work, they give you pay, you use the pay to buy goods, an exchange economy, right? And the market will figure out what the prices is. With us being in a capitalist society, capitalism makes a couple fundamental assumptions about the world in which we live, right? One, there's competition. And what's there competition for? According to the theories, we're really in competition for private property, right? And what we're trying to do is generate profits. And in generating profits and property, we are in a constant competition in all of our social institutions, right? And according to social Darwinism, which is one of the key roots to the whole idea of competition and capitalism, is that they make the fundamental assumption, there's three of them. One, survival of the fittest, right? That's the first one. Those who are the strongest to survive are going to survive. And therefore, in this particular class, those who are less likely to survive find themselves in prison, right? Because if you can survive within society, there's no reason for you to commit crime that's going to end you up in prison. The second dimension of social Darwinism is this whole thing called natural selection, right? It's not just enough to say that survival of the fittest is going to determine who the pecking order of society, who becomes the wealthiest, who becomes middle class, who becomes a white-collar worker, a blue-collar worker, or a pink-collar worker, or completely gets disenfranchised. According to natural selection, those who are poor because they're not capable of being middle class or upper middle class. May or may not make much sense, but when we take a look at things such as the way we treat the homeless, there certainly is a thing out there that we prescribe to, that somehow they are quote-unquote less human. And then the other part of it is, besides natural selection, that we find our location within society based upon our natural capabilities. The key ingredient to capitalism working is this idea of progress. Okay, society progresses from what they would say is a lower form to a higher form. That's what it is. Okay. Now, the reason why that's important is because essentially we are all in a social contract with each other. Man, I'm doing a lot of writing, aren't I? We're in a social contract, which means we're all indebted to each other. The social contract thinkers is a major break from the religious model of criminal justice. Prior to the Constitution, prior to the secularization of society, religion was the dominant form of explaining criminal and deviant behavior. So therefore, if somebody engaged in deviant behavior, they're regarded as inherently sinful, as inherently evil, and therefore would be punished most harshly. Okay? But if you consider that human beings are rational, right, and that rational means they are essentially enlightened, then what that means is that if you create laws, people are rational enough to follow the laws. And what the laws become, the law is glue, and the glue holds us together. So the reason why we have a law is that because it formalizes the social contracts that we are in. Social contract thinkers essentially say that everybody in society is under contract, and they're under contract to conform. So therefore, if they do not conform to the contract, we have the right and we have the obligation to punish those people. It's really very simple, correct? Now, the question is, when we talk about law, when we talk about punishment, is that Thomas Hobbes says that human beings are inherently evil, right? And therefore, they're negativistic, they're greedy, they do things that are in their own self-interest and not in anybody else's self-interest. And in doing so, what we do is we create laws so that we keep people in check, so they don't go running around doing whatever it is they want to do to engage in whatever they want to engage in, so that they can maximize their pleasure, right? So the other part of it is, hold on, let me put something down here. Let me write down a quick note here. All right, this is just so I won't forget. The opposite side, and this is for you, Eradio, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, who said that we're all tabula rasa. That is, we're all a blank slate. Right? In other words, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we're inherently good. We're born good. We're born cooperative. We're born as kind. We're not born inherently evil. So therefore, when people are misled, then it is our job as a society to bring them back in. So if we bring them back in, what that essentially means is that they are misdirected, much like a sickness. And this is for you, Radio. If they are sick, what we essentially have to do is cure their illness. And in curing their illness, what we're really saying is that the sickness model of criminal justice basically says that we have to rehabilitate. I can't read. See if I'm spelling it correctly. It's a rehabilitation model. However, if people are inherently evil, then what we have to do is we have to punish them. Right? Bang. It's as simple as that. So if you take a look at the papers that you wrote, I would imagine that some of you found a lot of torturous punishments. How many of you, and I'm going to give you a few seconds because I know there's a lag between where I am in my post and you. I think there's like a 5 or 6 second lag. So when you wrote your paper, did you find any forms of punishment or any kinds of torture that you just found to be like excruciatingly ridiculous, bizarre, inhumane, or anything of that nature? I'm going to give you a few seconds to try to answer that question. Did any of you find inhumanity in doing that assignment? And I'm going to come back in a second to the idea of progression. Don't forget progress, all right? Don't forget natural selection, and don't forget the idea of natural selection, progress, and survival of the fittest. Because those are really critical components of the social contract, right? So none of you really found anything that was particularly violent and inhumane. That's okay, because I have examples from all around the world, right? Let's go back to progress for just a second, all right? Progress means, essentially, that we go from lower forms to higher forms. Society goes from less civilized to civilized, from primitive to technologically advanced, right? So in other words, when we take a look at social Darwinism makes the argument that people in mass move from lower to higher levels, right? They do so through natural selection. And in doing so through natural selection, we find that people get stratified according to their abilities, right? Now, why is that important? Because what that means is that if there is a category of people who are naturally with the natural proclivity for failure or for success, those who succeed were the fittest, right? They either had the greatest mental aptitude or physical aptitude or whatever it is. But what's interesting about that is that if you take a look at the cultural context in which all of these ideas come into place, let's go back to that idea just for a second of enlightenment, okay? The Enlightenment period. I wish we were in discussion in class, because then we could have a discussion right now. The Enlightenment, just as it sounds like, means we basically went from, quote-unquote, the dark into the light. We went from irrational to rational. And why is that? The reason why is because at the end of the 1700s, what we started to see, particularly in England, a little bit in the United States, was the rise of the first industrial revolution, right? Where industry was now producing goods, whereas it used to be hand craftsmanship. And here's why that's important. The reason why that's important is because at that point, physics began to define the way in which the economic system was delivered to human beings. In other words, when you create the machines that produce the goods, what you're really doing is you're taking physics, you're taking mathematical equations, you're taking science to apply it to the economic system. And here's what happens. As we become more scientifically derived, as we become more scientifically driven in society, it gave way to the central ideas of religion explaining behavior. Now we start to see, at this point in time, the rise of the idea that science can explain our behavior. Science can explain our position. Science can explain crime. As a matter of fact, in 1803, Auguste Comte, sociologist, the first known sociologist, Auguste Comte made the argument that we can transform and use technology to create the perfect human being, which is really pretty important, because here's what the Enlightenment did. What the Enlightenment did is it said that, hey, look, we have science, we're actually rational creatures. We're not just driven by the dictates of God. We have the ability to think for ourselves. And because we have the ability to think for ourselves, right, that rationality allows us to look at punishment, to look at laws. So if we are in fact rational, and this is where you start to get the rise of the Enlightenment. There's an author, I'm just writing it down, sorry, so I don't forget. There's an author named Cesar Beccaria. Now Professor Sheaf says Beccaria, that's fine. My professor back in grad school called him Beccaria. Doesn't really matter. There he is. Cesar Beccaria basically said that humans are rational and that they have the ability. This is called the what do they call this? The Classical School of Criminology. Classical School of Criminology makes the assumption that we are rational, and the reason why we have laws is to protect people who break them, obviously, right? But there's an idea called nullum crimen sine lege. And what that means is there can be no crime nor punishment unless it's written in the law. Now, that sounds pretty normal, right? There's no crime or punishment unless it's written into the law. So if there's not a definition for behavior, for example, cybercrime 15 years ago, we didn't know how to define it. So we start to see this increase in cyber terrorism and cybercrime. Can you charge taxes across state lines? If I buy something in California, but I'm in Florida, do I have to pay taxes on that? Or is it illegal for me to get that without paying taxes? Right? We don't know exactly what that is. So unless there's a law written, it's not illegal. Okay, it makes sense, right? But at the same time, that means we can't punish you unless there's a law that says how you're going to be punished. Right? And what's that called is, Cesar Beccaria called that proportionality. In other words, the punishment must be proportionate to the crime if you want a rational system of justice to work. If the punishment is not proportionate to the crime, then it's going to undermine the very definition, the very philosophy behind crime. Why is that important? Because prior to the use of formal law, prior to the advent of enlightenment, it used to be under religious law. It was our job to extract the demons, the evil, from the wrongdoer. And say, for example, you steal the cow from the next door neighbor, or you butcher the cow and you make a bunch of meat, you cook it up, what have you, right? But you do it illegally. Well, if you stole their economic asset, which is the cow, and you eat it, it is possible that the response would be your death, correct? As a matter of fact, here's what we know. Vigilante justice was this idea. It wasn't innocent until proven guilty. It was guilty until proven innocent. So prior to the Enlightenment, you were considered guilty unless you could prove your innocence, right? So here's what the witch craze did. If you go back in time to the late 1400s, early 1500s, Europe, northeast United States, here's what we found. We found that the witches, the persons who were perceived to be witches, all you had to do was allege that they had done something illegal, and I'll explain what that is in a second, and you could punish them. And what they did is they would, bind them and rocks around their feet, throw them into the river, and if they floated, they were a witch, and if they didn't float, they died anyhow. So what you, hey Brian, so what you have was essentially is that you were guilty until you could prove yourself innocent. Now it's innocent until proven guilty. Why? Why is that? Why is it we switch from that? It's because the punishments were so inhumane. As a matter of fact, you didn't have to prove that the person was guilty, did you? With vigilante justice, all you had to do was have the speculation, preponderance of evidence that said that this person should be punished. And you saw a lot of people get stoned to death. You saw a lot of people get beaten to death. You saw a lot of people get tortured for crimes they never committed. Why? Because they were guilty until proven innocent. And what happened is that with Beccaria says you can't have disproportionate punishment for a crime. If a person steals your shoes, it's disproportionate for you to turn around and execute that person, right? So a person who engages in sexual assault should not get punished less or more. Well, let's see. Sexual assault shouldn't get punished less than a person who stole the bread. They should get punished more, right? As a matter of fact, watch this. Why is there so much chaos with Breonna Taylor? Why is there so much chaos when it comes to George Floyd? The reason is really simple. It's because the punishment, first of all, when the police officers were charged in Louisville, they weren't even charged with homicide, were they? They were charged with wanton endangerment of randomly firing a firearm and potentially harming somebody. So they weren't charged in anything that had to do with Breonna Taylor's death. There was no wrongful death charge. There wasn't even a negligence charge, right? There wasn't manslaughter. There was nothing that said that they consciously shot and killed her. So the response, the protest has been based upon the lack of proportionality. Because if you or I had walked into somebody's place and shot them, okay, we would be charged with murder in the first, definitely in the second. Okay, but how is that proportional? Is it because they're police officers they shouldn't be charged? Well, for you and I who are in the public saying, well, that's really unfair. That's what Beccaria is saying, is that the punishment, or at least even the charge, has to be proportionate to the behavior that they did, right? So two people, it doesn't make much sense that they didn't get charged. And that's why there's anger, because without proportionality in the system, rational adherence to the law will say, well, why am I being rational if it's unfair? So you have this whole notion of fairness being built into the system. And by the way, justice doesn't mean the correct punishment is meted out, okay? When we talk about due process, because this is really what is taking place with the Enlightenment, what we're really talking about at this point in time is the notion of due process, right? Due process basically means you are innocent until you're proven guilty. We can't just go ahead and knock you off. By the way, what was it, 2 years ago? There was the gunman up in Dallas in the parking garage, remember? And the police, they sent a robot in and they blew the guy up. They literally blew him up with the robot. Rather than going up there and trying to arrest him, they blew the guy up. Now here's the problem. It's interesting, criminologically, that they were able to use technology to come to a conclusion, right? But there was a lot of gravity in terms of the choice to execute that person, because the problem is that you can't prosecute somebody without evidence. That's due process. You have to have the right to have your case be rationally passed through the system. This is all in Enlightenment thinking, right? This is all classical school criminology. You have to weigh the evidence, and the reason why is this. By the way, when a crime is committed, and I'd ask this in class, but since I can't get a lot of feedback, if you get punched in the face, okay, you get an aggravated assault, or somebody hits you in the face with a weapon, I don't know, they hit you with, a broom handle, and it knocks you down, and you're laying there. You're bleeding all over the place, right? Who's the victim? Who's the victim of the crime? That's a good question, right? It seems obvious that you get hit in the face, or you get punched in the face, or something like that. There's an assault here, and if there's a weapon, it's aggravated assault. But the question is, who is the victim? Well, under a due process, the individual is not the victim. You, who got punched in the face, is not the victim. The victim is the state. right? So whenever there's a court hearing, it's the state versus OJ, right? It's not, oh wait, yeah, it's not Nicole Brown Simpson who is the victim. It's the state versus OJ. But if it's a civil case in which OJ lost, it is Goldman against Simpson. It is Simpson against Simpson. But when it comes to crime, it's a lot different. When it comes to crime, the victim is the state, right? And here's the reason why. Because under that particular, under the Constitution, you are really basically protected from the inequities from the state, not individuals. Right? You are protected from state wrongdoing. So the reason why so many people, when they get the death penalty, don't get executed is because okay, here's what Beccaria said. Beccaria said as part of a rational system that no rational system can have the death penalty. A lot of people don't like that, right? Because they say, well, you do something heinous, you harm a child, you should die. You kill somebody, you should die, etc., etc., etc. Well, here's the question, all right? And it's a really interesting philosophical question. If there's no due process and we have vigilante justice, the perpetrator dies. The problem is we don't have the evidence to know whether there was intent to cause harm. See, here's what you got to measure. You got to measure intent and you got to measure harm. If you don't measure those, you can never have a proportionate system. Okay, so we take a look at this, all right? How much intent did they have? What if they have a mental health issue? Can they even form intent? What if they're under the age of 18? By the way, back in the late 1700s, young kids, they weren't considered as adults anyhow. So they were treated as little humans, which meant that they had the ability to think just like an adult. So if they engaged in wrongdoing, their punishment was the same as a grown-up, as a grown man or a grown woman. By the way, there wasn't a distinction in gender back then. If you had enough rationality to engage in the crime, you get the same punishment, right? Early on. So that comes with classification, which comes later in the system. So now we're taking a look at this whole idea, who are you protected from? We are protecting you from the state. We're protecting you from the injustice. What we're really talking about, justice isn't equality. Justice is regarded as procedural justice. In other words, were the procedures of criminal justice accurately utilized in the arrest, in the detention, in the collection of evidence, etc., in the punishment, in the sentencing? In other words, it has to be bound by law. Otherwise, you have inequity in the system and it breaks down the rational justice system. Well, that causes a lot of problems, doesn't it? It causes a lot of problems for us when we think that people get off because of a technicality. I know what's her name? Anthony, Kaylee Anthony and Casey Anthony, right? You all are ticked off. Now, you may be a little bit young to remember the case because that happened about 7 years ago. But a lot of people wanted Casey Anthony whacked. They said she should die no matter what. No matter what happens, she did that crime. We don't need any more evidence. She did it. She dies. That's what people wanted. That's why she's still in hiding. If she comes out of hiding, the odds are there's going to be vigilante justice, which circumvents the whole notion. Here's what criminal justice is based upon. Criminal justice and the classical school is based upon the idea that you should receive due process. And that means this, and this is where people they lose their mind, right? The worst person in your nation has to be permitted to get full justice. Every component of the criminal justice system has to be used for the worst person as well as the best. Because if you don't provide the protections to the worst person, the one who we think is who should be punished, then something amazing happens. If that worst person doesn't get equal protections under the law, there's no guarantee that you will either. Right? So we get upset when things apparently get thrown out because of a technicality. Well, what technicality? What is a technicality? What's the law about the technicality? You and I typically don't know the law. We know there's a law, but we don't know the law. And here's what's interesting about it. There is no such thing as a law, baby. There's no such thing as law. If I go to the idea of what is called symbolic interactionism, right? What that means is all interaction is based upon our ability to communicate through signs and through symbols. So The fact that when I say hello and you say hi, that means when I say hello to you, I have created a language system of cooperation or kindness or manners or whatever you want to say. And in return, you say hello. In doing so, we have created a situation, a context in which what? In which we can cooperate. Okay? If I give you a gift and you don't say thank you, you say, right here, buddy. I'm not going to buy you another gift, am I? Because why? Because you symbolically said that what I gave you is dismissed. What I gave you is something that you don't appreciate. Okay? So what we do is we go through the process of constructing what is real. And in our system, when you have a justice system based upon the law, you have an adversarial system. You have the prosecutors and you have the defense. Now look, we're not even talking about the crime anymore. You notice that? See, criminology, corrections, punishment has nothing to do with the crime. That's irrelevant. What's relevant is how do we construct the definition that this behavior was illegal under this law as it's written in non crimen sine lege. But here's the deal. The law is written, but how many of you know the law? How many of you sit back and read all those books in the law school? None of you. And if you have, that's because you want to be an attorney pretty badly, correct? So if your ability to engage in behavior has to do with your knowledge, your rationality of the law, but you've never read the law, then you really don't know what it is. So then you engage in a behavior. Whatever the behavior is, hey, what's up, Bradley? Whatever the behavior is, you engage in it, okay? Well, now we have to see whose definition is going to be applied. The defense and the prosecutors read the same law, but then they have case law where they use different cases to come in and prove or disprove the case, where they try to come in and say, no, this person's innocent or this person's guilty. Then they try to interpret the law itself, and then the judge guides them in how to interpret the law. If we're talking about interpreting the law, that means the law doesn't exist in and of itself. It is a system of interpretation. Now here's more to it, right? This is all symbolic interactionism. A behavior takes place, whatever it is, right? We steal the cow and we shoot you because you stole the cow. But we don't really know if you were stealing the cow. Maybe you were just petting the cow. Maybe you wanted to ride a horseback as if you were riding a horse. Who knows? Okay. Now all of a sudden what happens? A witness has to define that behavior as criminal. That's point number one in the criminal justice system, right? Somebody has to acknowledge that a behavior was engaged in. Then there has to be a definition that the behavior is illegal. Then someone has to say, you know what? They engaged, I believe in something illegal, I need to report it. Then, when the police come out, they too have to define it as a behavior that was illegal. If they don't, then there's no crime. If the crime isn't reported, there is no crime. So, even if a behavior takes place, but there's no report of it, and there's no formal sanction of it, guess what? It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Simple. And you get enough of those situations in which a crime, quote unquote, doesn't exist, you create something remarkable. You create what is called the dark figure of crime. That is all the unknowns about crime. So let's say we take a look at that. Most crime is unknown. Did you know that only 49% of all violent crimes are ever reported? 49%. So we have a media that continuously produces images, whether it's movies or TV or shows or what have you, that continuously produces images of violence. And those are the things that we're most concerned about behaviorally are violent acts, even though we tend to focus more on homicide. Well, if we were so worried about violence being perpetrated against us, why is it only 49% is reported? By the way, if you're the victim of a property crime, say larceny theft, only about 14% of larceny thefts are ever reported. 1 in 10 rapes are reported. Right? We take a look at burglary. It depends on the dollar value, maybe 33%. So now we take a look at which crimes are reported and which not. Every crime that goes unreported creates a dark figure of crime, which means there's a whole lot of information that we know nothing about. So we can't make those kind of assumptions along the way. But what else does that mean? That means that we construct crime. It doesn't exist in and of itself. See, here's where we have the big problem. The big problem is we think we know about crime, we think we know about punishment, and the fact of the matter is we know very little. And the reason is because at the most fundamental level, we don't apply definitions to it. The definitions are too fluid. So we sit back and we say, let me think about this. That person's horrible. They're really horrible. Well, for that one person, and take homicide out of this discussion, most people are never reported. Did you know that in the year prior to someone getting incarcerated, the 1 year prior to their incarceration for the crime they committed, on average, every inmate committed roughly 352 crimes in a given year, on average, right? About 10% committed over 1,000. About 10% committed less than 10, right? But the average is 352. But they're only going to prison for one crime. So what does that mean about the dark figure crime, even among those who are most crime prone? Is that we know very little. So if we know very little, how then can we ever have a proportionate system, right? And it also means that if it doesn't exist in and of itself, that means that crime is a living organism. It's not a fixed entity. That's the key. That is the key, is that it is a living organism. Meaning, it is a system of interpretations. Let that sink in for a minute. Our criminal justice system is a system of interpretations. It's a system of interpretations, which means it's rooted in philosophy. Okay? It's rooted in philosophy. Back in 1998, I had a student who was an upper-ranking member of a street gang. He was a vice lord out of Cincinnati, and he was like the corporal, so he's like third in command in the state. And one day, he wrote up on one of the boards at University of Louisville a whole bunch of gang graffiti. And I saw it, and I walked in, and they passed out a memo to everybody on campus that there was a violent threat that we had to clear off campus. No one could come to class because they saw this threat. And I walked in, and I didn't know about, because I don't check email. So I read this, and there was nothing in it that was threatening to anybody because I could read blood graffiti at the time. Well, the news came in, and I'm sitting there reading it, so they said, "Can you read that?" I said, "Of course," and I read it for them. And then we do a little news promo. Next day when I show up, there's something with Crips written all over my board in my class, and it was threatening. And it says, "You don't know what you're talking about. How about if we take you out and we beat you down?" I said, "Well, now that is a threat." And I said, "Yeah, well, okay." Well, as it turns out, a couple of years later, I had the Crip in class, and he ended up being a remarkable student. He's an engineer now. And the other guy, he used to sell marijuana, weed, and it ended up I got him out of the gang and got him a job selling Scott's Miracle Grow, which is also grass, and which is always the irony. But one day he arrived late to class, and I was talking in the class about how do we train a puppy. Okay, and the way in which you train a puppy tells me everything I need to know about your philosophy on crime and punishment. All right. So, let's say, for example, you have a puppy, and you're trying to train it. You're trying to potty train it. Okay. If you believe that the puppy should be trained by keeping them in a crate, and then taking them out once a day or whatever, twice a day, then you believe in incapacitation. You remove the wrongdoer, the puppy, and you put it in a crate. You incapacitate them so that they can't engage in the behavior that you're trying to prevent. That's a philosophy, right? Remove them from society. They shouldn't even be out here. Take them out. Or you let the puppy out and you spank it. Boosh! You should be outside. Rub its nose in the urine and then you take it out the door, right? Well, in that case, you're looking at a revenge model. You're looking at a punishment model, a get tough model. You do the crime, you do the time, right? So you have a get tough model, or you have an incapacitation model, or, right, you just take the puppy outside and say, outside. Show it what it did, outside. Show it what it did, outside. You're trying to rehabilitate the puppy, right? In other words, you are saying, you know what, each puppy is different, and I'm going to train it how to be this, Okay, so we have these different methodologies, these different philosophies on how we raise a puppy, and we have the same philosophies about what we should do with criminal offenders. Should we lock them up and throw away the key and never let them out? Boom, right? That's a punishment model. Okay, or should we say, you know, just like a sickness, they have a sickness, and if we prescribe the right medication over time, they will be better and they can go back out in society, right? Rehabilitation, right? Or we can just say, you know what, just warehouse them. Just let them sit away in prison for 7 years and take them back out, okay? Or execute them, which is the ultimate form of incapacitation, all right? If it's a get tough model, right, then what we're really trying to do is we're trying to deter them because they're rational. This is your classical school of criminology. Classical school of criminology is basically saying that if you punish the person in proportionate to the crime that they committed, they will rationally not engage in the crime again, right? And by doing it properly, you have what is called general deterrence, in which the entire public learns that if you do the wrong crime, if you do the crime, you're going to do the time. So you don't do it, right? That's a philosophy, baby. That's a philosophy based upon, do you think people are evil and rational? If they're evil and rational and they choose to do the crime, if they choose it, then you punish them. However, if you say, you know what, there's a sickness in their system, in their thinking or whatever, they've been misled. They're good people, but they've been misled. With the proper medications, with the, not literally medications, with the proper programs or what have you, they can be rehabilitated. Okay? So what's happening is our philosophy of how to raise the puppy is also translated into our philosophy of what we should do with criminal offenders. But we just don't take into account the idea that we have this ability. Now, we go back to social Darwinism for a second. The reason why social Darwinism was so important is because not only did it give scientific credence for the defining behaviors as somehow different, which it did, it also was utilized in a lot of ways to justify racism and classism and things of that nature. Why? Because if there's natural selection, then those persons who are poor are naturally selected to be poor. That's the whole philosophy behind the incident. If people end up enslaved, it's partially because their natural selection is that they should be enslaved. Because one of the arguments that was used in the 1800s is that even if you emancipated slaves, they wouldn't have the capability to be free. So they prefer, and this is how they're portrayed in the news. They're portrayed in plays, not news, but in the plays and on Broadway, etc. They're portrayed as happy, but also equally violent. So if you portrayed the slave as happy, then that basically made the argument that they did not want to be free because of the amenities. It's just like you say. Just like you say with inmates. People say it all the time. Well, they get three cots in a hot, or 3 hots in a cot. They want to be in prison. If they didn't want to be in prison, they wouldn't be there. It's the same argument as natural selection, right? This is what they want because they can't handle anything else. I think it's kind of ludicrous, right? I think it's entirely ludicrous because what it's based upon is what was called an atavist, right? Positive school of criminology. You had Cesar Beccaria, and now you have Cesar Lombroso. Lombroso was basically saying that we can use science to predict who our criminal offenders are. Why? Because they're atavistic. A criminal is atavistic. Atavistic. They are throwbacks to an earlier kind. Right? Enslavement. Throwbacks to an earlier kind. Incarceration. Throwbacks to an earlier kind. You got to remove those people who are of an earlier type. Now here's what the issue is that when you throw in progression, it makes the assumption that certain groups, entire categories of groups, cannot move forward. Why? Because of the category. If they could, the progression would be upward, but we see that it isn't. Then we use arguments to justify biological racism, biological sexism, even biological social class arguments have been used to define what punishments are acceptable, right? For example, what was it called? It was the movement, the fertilization, not the fertilization. It was the, gosh, I can't think of it right offhand. It's the one where, what's it called? When women weren't permitted to have babies any longer. Gosh, I'll think of the term in a little bit. But in any case, we've had punishments that have been meted out based upon where people are in the scientific hierarchy. And the problem with it is that once we say that this is scientifically documented and scientifically proven, then what happens is that it becomes a part of fact. There's no longer question. But really what we saw is that while we're seeing the rise of the second industrial revolution, we're using science to define human behavior. And in doing so, we start seeing punishments based upon science. As a matter of fact, I was just watching a documentary, and I give you an option in your announcement boards to either watch Shawshank Redemption or the movie Life for the movie for this class, right? And there's a link. If you can find it for free, do it. If you can't, just use the link. I think Shawshank is $14.99, but Life is $3.99 or something like that. Hey, Roxana, nice to see you. But when slavery came to an end, right, during slavery, there were what were called slave police, which were specifically designed only to watch over the slave population so that they didn't try to escape or engage in behavior that was regarded as rebellious or something that would overthrow the local government or what have you. As a matter of fact, the woman who raised me was witness to the greatest mass lynching in American history when 319 African Americans were lynched in northeast Arkansas for trying to form a union so that they would be paid fairly as a sharecropper. And what happened was it was called the Elaine Massacre. And in the Elaine Massacre, 319 or more people were literally lynched at that time, right? But just keep in mind for a second, on a side note, that Mexicans were also lynched, right, throughout the United States at the same rate, if not higher, than African Americans. And the reason was because, quote unquote, by definition, they were stealing jobs from the mainstream. At least they were perceived to be stealing jobs from the mainstream. So when there's that perception, then what we have seen historically is we've seen these punishments that are far outside of the expectation of what should be happening, and way outside of proportionality, as according to Beccaria. That's the reason why you have due process. The reason you have due process is for the fact so you don't have persons who are innocent being killed for reasons that haven't been proven. That's why you have a criminal justice system. And for us who complain that people get off on technicalities, you got to take into account the fact that A, you weren't there, B, you haven't seen the evidence, C, you haven't read the law either. So when we have a response in the general public to a miscarriage of justice, ours is based upon this idea that we think we know is right and wrong based upon our mind. But the fact of the matter is that's not criminal justice. That's just an inquisitorial model. So we're blinded by the idea that we want an inquisitorial model because we somehow believe that our perspective, our emotional response to whatever is happening in terms of criminal behavior is correct. When the fact is, we have a system that's based upon equally and thoroughly reviewing all the evidence. And by the way, O.J. Simpson is the only person that I can remember that got a full system of justice. Because your rights when you go into a court system, right, is you are supposed to have the right to have every piece of evidence equally weighed out and regarding. Every single piece. That costs a lot of money, right? And most of us don't have the pockets that are deep enough to have all the DNA on everything examined, to have all the cross-checking on every single witness, every single shred of evidence. We don't have it, which brings up something completely different. And that is access to justice based upon economics. Because if that's what it is, then you also have a system that undermines itself by definition. Because if everyone can't have the same amount of coverage in a system of due process, then by definition the internal contradiction means that you can never have justice, which means you can never have an ethical system. Which, going back to Beccaria, you can never execute a person. And here's the reason why you can't execute a person. Because if the Constitution is designed to protect you from the state, and the state is permitted to kill you, then the state, by definition, has undermined its own central philosophy, right? Protection from state abuses. You can't have the British come sleep in your bedroom anymore because you got protections from it. And by the way, the Second Amendment is really controversial. Not because you should or shouldn't own a gun, because who belongs to a militia? And what is a militia? So if you're part of a standing militia, you're like, well, the standing militia was to protect you from having the British sleep in your house and tell you that they're going to stay there while they're waging war against against the colonies or the colonists. So what do you have? You have all these interpretations, but we don't really know what all the interpretations are. So what you witness when you watch criminal justice and you watch these debates, you're not watching anything that has to do with crime and justice. You're witnessing people who are trying to construct a definition of what's right and wrong. You're watching a social construction right in front of your face. You're not watching the law, you're watching the law being constructed, which is a wholly entirely different thing. The therapeutic approach, Bradley's asking about that. No, I don't think it's a waste of time, right? His question is, what are your thoughts on the therapeutic approach like Germany? Do you feel it's a waste of money or money well spent? Here's what I think, Bradley, here's what I think. I think we have as many pieces of justice as we have politicians, okay? If we want due process, right, theoretically, it shouldn't be driven by party lines. It should be driven by the law, not party lines, all right? And here's what we see over time. The way in which we administer justice, there's a thing called the Justice Pendulum, all right, where the Justice Pendulum will vary from a rehabilitation model all the way over to a punishment model. Well, the behavior and the motivation to engage in wrongful behavior hasn't changed ever. People engage in wrong behavior. I mean, that's a part of human nature. I mean, according to Emil Durkheim, all right, even if you have a society of saints where everybody in the society is saintly, Durkheim argues, oh, here, I better write that down, Durkheim. He argues that even in a society of saints, the saints are going to find a way to define other saints as deviant. Maybe they write in their Bible too slow. Maybe their notes are too fast. Maybe they speak too fast. Maybe they don't eat enough. But they will find a way to find deviance, because deviance, according to Durkheim, is designed to produce conformity. Because if you know behavior that is non-normative, then you won't break it. And our job is to show people, basically deterrence, what is not acceptable so that they can rationally decide not to do it. All right? So you always have to have deviance so that people will want to conform. Now, if we vacillate from a rehabilitation model over to a punishment model, all right, if that's what we vacillate to and from, the question is, are we vacillating back and forth based upon changes in crime patterns, or are we changing based upon cultural ethos at a given era? Are we changing based upon crime, or are we changing because of shifting ideological structures? For example, 1973, baby, that is the critical year. You better put that in your notes. I'm coming back to you. Don't worry, Bradley. 1973 is the year that changed criminal justice in America. All right? Here's what was happening. And I lived in 73. I was 7 years old, man. It was fun. It was interesting. It was scary, and it was engaging. Oh, it was crazy. You know, you had protests going on in the 60s. You had civil rights. You had equal rights. You had gay rights. You had prisoner rights. In other words, it was during the 60s and the early 70s, what we were really looking at was the overthrow of the current structure. All right? Because during the 60s, we saw that there was a lot of injustice, much like people are prescribing to today, right? Based upon race, based upon class, etc., etc. Well, during this period, this anti-disestablishmentarian period, where we really were looking to overthrow the establishment because it was perceived to be unfair, right? Well, during that period, if you look at criminology, there was a rise in conflict criminology, right? In other words, what's conflict criminology? Conflict criminology says that criminal justice is based upon social class. The criminal justice system, according to conflict theorists, is designed, here let me write that down, conflict theory, right, is designed to repress and suppress the poor, allowing for the wealthy to maintain their position. Hey, Bijou, right? That's what it's designed for. That's what it's designed for, okay? In other words, when we go into, I've worked in prisons, I've taught in prisons, I've been a corrections officer in prison. I was in a juvenile maximum security institution. Not long, baby. I got out of there. But I was there for about 4, 5, 6 months. And I found myself in a situation where I was under threat, and it took them 3 or 4 minutes to get my back up in there. And I was like, no, baby, I'm out of here. This is just a summer job. I'm not trying to be someone's girlfriend. Because there's a guy who's threatening, you're going to be my girlfriend. I said, not today. You better back. And there's a minor riot going on because my partner had taken his forearm and put it on the throat of a dude named Kincaid, who was a blood from Los Angeles. And he was just playing ping pong with a Crip from Pomona, a Rolling 20s Crip. His name was Madball. So Kincaid and Madball, you know, they're playing ping pong. They get in an argument. Kincaid says a curse word. You're not allowed to say a curse word on the unit. Me, I'm like, these are kids playing ping pong, right? So I'm more rehabilitation. And Ross, who was my partner, he was punishment model. He said, you can't curse in here. It's an arbitrary rule, but he puts them on the ground, slides them across. The dude goes pick up a phone and hit him. You got 6 guys in the back hallway who are cleaning with mops and stuff. Then everyone else is on the program. So I told everyone in the program to stay still. We locked the door to the office. He tried to put Kincaid in the hole. It was illegal for us to touch him. I didn't touch him. I wasn't going to do anything illegal. And I had a button on me. It looked like a walkie-talkie. It's called a man down. If you get hit in the face at a 45-degree angle, the man down sounds all the alarms in the system, and all the free hands within the prison have to come running to your backup. Well, there were 6 guys back there cleaning. I got along with all of them except one, Gato. Gato, he's like, man, I've been waiting for this day, man. I've been waiting to make you my girlfriend. And he takes the mop and he takes the head of the mop off. I said, man, you need to stand back. And Ross is saying, just help me get the guy in the hole. I said, man, I'm telling everyone to get back, because we're locked back with them. They can't get out and no one can get in. So there's 6 against the 2 of us, 7 if you include Kincaid, who's on the ground. And I'm like, and they're coming, I'm backing them off. I said, you're going to get written up and you're all going in the hole. But Gatto didn't care. And I said, nah, man, not today. So I hit the man down. And nobody showed up. I was like, and I'm looking around. And, 3 or 4 minutes go by. And it's 6 against 2, 7 against 2. Which is interesting. We have 7 concurrent viewers and 2 likes on this video. 7, that's a side note. And so at the end of that day, I still had about 2 hours left of my duty. So we went to the gym to play basketball. Madball was on my team. I hit him with the overhead backhanded alley-oop. He took a one-hand tomahawk and threw it down. He said, hey, baby, nice pass. All the guys are giving me a high five and stuff. I said, all right, thank you. 4 o'clock hit. I walked out the door and never came back. Man, you must be crazy. You must be crazy. But here's the thing. So we had this anti-disestablishment period of time, and in 1973, right, see, in the 60s, under a conflict model, we try to rehabilitate wrongdoers, okay, because they've been misled. They're still people. And so rehabilitation gave rise until 1973. In 1973, with all the chaos that was being portrayed on the TV, with everything that was going on, we had to, people made the argument that we got to get tough, law and order campaign, war on poverty, we got to get tough on all these things. And in 1973, Robert Martinson wrote a landmark article that said, when it comes to rehabilitation, nothing works. And it is at that time, 1973, that we saw a philosophical shift from the rehabilitation model into the punishment model. And at that point, everything shifted. Policing shifted, courts shifted, prison shifted from rehab into punishment. Now, coming back to you, Bradley, here's what I think. On the one hand, I do think people can change. I mean, fundamentally, going back through the Who Am I assignment, I do think people have the ability to change. I have. I've changed in the last, it depends on how you define it, but in the last month, I've changed tremendously. Last year, 2-3 years, I've changed a lot. And as I've grown up, I've changed. I saw bad behavior. I said, I don't like it. I'm going to change it. And I changed it. That's what we do. So is it possible to change? I think it is. Is it possible for an offender to change? I think so. Because I've seen a lot of offenders go in, mean, nasty people. They find religion, and a lot of them change and never come back in. Right? And then recidivism, we'll talk about it later. But most don't recidivate, at least not for a new crime. If they recidivate because they had urine, or they had alcohol in their urine, and we send them back for a technical violation, but not for a new crime. Right? So that's where your recidivism rates come from. But all we see is recidivism. All right. Now, what shifted was when we went to a get tough model, we changed the way in which people were sentenced from indeterminate to determinate. We'll talk about that later in the semester. Right? We went from parole into you get punished and you leave. All right? So parole starts to shift, punishment starts to shift. The question was, Bradley, did the behavior shift? Well, behaviors didn't shift. Okay? The motivation didn't shift. It was the philosophy that shifted. And here's where we make our mistake. There are some really, really mean people in prison. Some of them probably can't be rehabilitated for various reasons. In those cases, punishment is probably the way to go. In other cases, there's some really decent people in prison who were in a bad situation who could actually probably do pretty well out in society, right? And with the proper therapy, could do well, right? All sex offenders are not the same. But yet and still, when we have sex ed programs, we put them all into the same program. Well, that's fine, except that a power or control rapist is not the same as a pedophile. Okay? So if you throw them all in the same modality, you're mixing the needs with the modality. And if you misalign it, then what you can do is make the situation worse. And I think that really what you're watching when the pendulum switches back and forth is what you're really watching is what is happening to the economic system. It is no mistake that we've elected a president who abides by a get tough policy. After 15, 20 years of, going back to a community model, community policing model, letting people out earlier because, they've done well in prison or what have you, trying to drive down the number of people who occupy our prisons, what we see instead is a get tough president. But that's not an accident, okay? I'm not supporting him or not supporting him. The reason that he's come into the presidency with that particular philosophy was a shift in economics. You see, economics underlies the way in which corrections is distributed. But we don't see it that way. We see it as these people doing the wrong things when really what we need to look at is what is the overlap of these institutions. How are these institutions working at a given time? Because the pendulum will switch back. When prisons became too expensive, when America started having an incarceration rate of 683 per 100,000, which superseded China, it supersedes China, Russia, and Cuba. You're talking about 3 totalitarian nations, and we have a higher incarceration rate than any industrialized nation on the planet, right? But we say we're not strong enough or tough enough. Well, we're putting people away at higher rates and for longer sentences than anywhere in the world, right? Why? Well, at a certain point, you can only build so many prisons and so many beds before the economics starts to eat away at the system itself. So what we started to do is we start reverting back to trying to gain control of the prison industrial complexes, which is what it's called, in terms of trying to drive down the amount of expenditure, because it's a huge industry. In driving it down, we start pushing more towards a variety of punishments. It's not because all of a sudden we're softer. It's not because all of a sudden we're meaner. It's because we can't afford the freaking system. It's a broken system. So it's a system that is literally designed to fail because, going back to you, Bradley, we misidentify the needs with the philosophy of the dominant persons. Maybe we need get tough policies in policing at times. Maybe we need community policing at times. I personally believe that there's a whole restructuring that is necessary, but it's all philosophically driven. Here's what I want you to get out of this, okay? Crime, punishment, and incarceration is not a reflection of criminal behavior. It is a reflection of the cultural ethos at a given period of time. It is a reflection of the way in which we define behavior, not the behavior. So basically, take a look at murder. Take a look at murder. It's a great example. You see me walking across campus, you're not allowed to murder me. But if we're at war, you're allowed to murder me. It's the same behavior, but the way in which we define the behavior is constructed. So according to, again, Durkheim, anything can be deviant and anything can be normal. It's just a matter of how it's defined. Now that's critical, right? Because now, see, Durkheim, he's what you call a functionalist. All right, so whereas Marx is a conflict theorist, functionalist, Durkheim is a functionalist. Basically, what he's saying is, and if you're in the narcotics class and you're jumping in here right now, we're going over with corrections, but it still applies to you. It's all good. Functionally, what that means is all those institutions work together to promote stability. The reason why you incarcerate people is so that there's stability in society. Okay? We protect the status quo by taking away the wrongdoers. That's what the functionalists want. That's what they argue. So when the institutions work together smoothly, then you're going to have less crime. Okay? And if you have less crime, then you don't have the same need to put people in prison. However, like right now, when there's decay in the social order, Hello, Andre. If there's decay in the social order, then the institutions have to work together to fix the decay. And in fixing the decay is called anomie, all right? When there's societal breakdown and there's a sense of normlessness, that normlessness is met with people feeling as if they are angry, they're confused, they don't know where to lash out, all right? So based upon that, what you're seeing is, like in the protests, you're seeing a response to a breakdown in societal institutions. And take a look at it. The economic order is shifting. The political order is shifting. We have artificial intelligence, which is the scientific component, that is shifting. So we have all these shifts taking place, and it's creating a sense of normlessness. So people are acting out because they don't explain it institutionally. They just see in front of them the despair, right? The difficulties in everyday life. So what we're noting is that anomie is an outcome. Hey, Paul. Narcotics people, I'm going to talk to you in just a second. So what you're seeing is that decay. Now, by the way, let's go back to torture for just a second. Why is it in the 16 and 1700s the Chinese had a thing called the pig? And the pig was horrible. What they did is they threw people into a cast iron pig. And it looked like a pig. It had nostrils as a pig. But if they had broken the laws of the state, a person who was engaging in treason, right, was put in the pig and cooked alive. But when they screamed, it sounded like a pig that was in fact screeching, right? Horrible. But it was designed for what? To create conformity. In the United States, they used to have a punishment called the Brank. And what the Brank was essentially a bird cage that came over your head, okay? And it rested on your shoulders, right? It was stood on your shoulders. And you're put in the city square and you had to stand there for maybe 24 or 48 hours. But what they did was, and this is all Durkheim stuff, all right? What they did is when they put the Brank on your head, there was a razor blade that went up underneath your tongue. And what would happen is that as you were, hey Arya, as you were in the city center, 24 hours with a razor blade underneath your tongue, essentially every single person who received that punishment while people were throwing stuff at them, they ended up dying because their tongue got severed from the inside of their mouth. Now, what was the crime that they committed in which they got the Brank? The Brank was given to people who gossiped. You hear that? Gossiping got you the Brank. And you're like, oh my God, that's inhumane. It's unbelievable. It is, according to current standards. But in that cultural ethos, in that cultural period, it had a very specific role. Take a look at it, all right? I'm not justifying it. I'm just explaining to you from a functionalist perspective. If functionalism is based upon this idea of stability, and that people should be integrated into a belief system. Yeah, I know, and Andre, I know, right? If everyone was integrated into the same belief system, then you'd have stability, right? You wouldn't have deviance. You'd have nothing but conformity. If everybody is regulated into the division of labor, and their skills are met with pay for what they produce, right? If they're well regulated in the division of labor, you're not going to have crime. So if they're integrated and they're regulated, you're not going to have crime. If there's solidarity in the system, then the level of crime is going to go down. Now here's why, as you look through those papers on crime and unusual punishment, here's what you will have noted. The most brutal forms of punishment happen in less civilized societies. And I don't want to say less civilized because that's really progressive, but societies that weren't technologically advanced. The level of violence and punishment decreases with, this is Durkheim, not me, with civilization. Right? Why? Because if you gossip in a town that has 50 to 100 or 200 people, if you gossip and undermine that system, what you do is you throw the whole entire community into disequilibrium. And if you throw the whole entire community into disequilibrium, it creates anomie. So what they saw in it, Durkheim called this the normal and the pathological. In other words, punishments were based upon and meted out in accordance to level of civilization. So when there's more vulnerability, because there's greater cohesion, but a smaller population, then what happens? there has to be more severe punishment. Why? To keep people in line. Otherwise, one gossip, one underlying lie can actually destroy the whole entire system. So what we see is those type of totalitarian regimes. The reason why there's more severe punishment is because you have to have people to stay in line. It's philosophy, people. It's not in the behavior. Do you get it? When we look at crime and criminology, yep, hey Sharon, when we look at crime and criminology, we're not talking about the behavior. The criminal behavior is almost irrelevant. What matters is, what is the philosophy? What is the cultural ethos? What is the nature of community? What are the factors in that community that has an impact on the way in which people behave and how they're punished? Right? Now this is unbelievable. I don't know what to do with myself now. Because now we got the people from the narcotics class coming in and people here in the corrections class. We're at the end of what we're going to do. But anyhow, 3 theories. Okay, the 3 theories. Conflict theory, 1. 2, functionalist theory. Both are macro theories. Functionalism is Durkheim. Conflict theory is Marx. And then we have symbolic interaction, right? The symbols that we had talked about earlier. And those symbols are based upon George Herbert Mead. I don't know what's right, baby. I don't know what the right answer is. I don't know what the wrong answer is. But I do know that crime and justice is a process. It is not a fixed destination. You got to remember that. It is not a fixed destination. We have departments of corrections. Hey, Andy. Right? Department of Corrections, which means we correct. We have departments of rehabilitation, which means we change. We have houses of the feeble-minded back in the day, right? Because the mind was weak. We had insane asylums. So in other words, the nature of our punishment is really a reflection of the philosophy of the age, right? All right, now I don't know what to do with myself. Okay, I got to do a quick check here. Now, by a show of hellos, who here is in the narcotics class? Well, actually, here's what I got to do. I'm sorry to do this to you. The people in the narcotics class, I'm going to have to start a new live stream. So if you would, Richie, Andy, some of those of you who came in here later, Paul, let me stop this, all right, and let me start it back in, because I don't want to confuse you, because we just had corrections class and it segued over into narcotics. So let me go ahead and keep doing it. Keep doing the hello. So we have Andy, Richie, Paul, Sharon, Bijou. I'm going to ask you if you don't mind logging off for a moment, and I'm going to go ahead and log off. Let me reestablish the connection. So why don't we give me 5 minutes. We'll come back at 5:58. Okay, let's come back at 5:58, and we'll go ahead and do our narcotics class. Oh, that's okay, Andy. Don't worry about it. Those of you who are in corrections, come on over to the narcotics class. We're talking about the same theories, but nonetheless, we're going to see what we have to do. All right, I'm going to stop this stream, and then for those of you in corrections, in narcotics, I'm going to start it back up. Give me about 5 minutes. Let's just go ahead and start at 6. Let's start at 6. All right, I hope that's okay. I hope that's okay. Bradley, great question. Let me see. Yeah, you should be half and half. If you're a thinker, you don't just passively accept what people give you. You weigh it out for yourself, and then what you're going to do is, over time, you're going to learn to align your theory. Then you're going to find data for it, and you're going to either support it or refute it, because there is data that can support all these ideas. Anyhow, here, let me go ahead and log off here, and then the rest of you, I'll be back here in 5 minutes. Have a great evening. Oh, and have a great weekend.